circus is coming through. Everybody knows that when you purchase a ticket, you expect to get a show. Take a look at me. I'm just a clown.
All right. Welcome to the Mid-Coast Scuba Podcast. Got my dive buddy and friend Patrick Danko here. We're going to talk about rebreathers.
Sounds good.
Yeah. How long have you been diving a rebreather?
That is a really good question. I should probably pull up my, while we're talking, I'll pull up my cert. I got, been certified for several years now. You asked me that. I've got to go pull up the old TDI app and figure out where I'm at. Quite a few years ago, 5-6 years ago, I think probably at this point. I got certified through one of our kind of local Midwestern instructors here, Jesse, down at Reef Runner.
Yeah.
Had been really interested in getting into rebreather diving, and he had had been looking at some of the dive rate units, and he had a pretty much brand new, just slightly used Optima back mount, pretty modern spec used, and he cut me a good deal on it along with some training, and rest is history. So
any penny saved in the rebreather world is good.
Well, yeah, for sure. Yeah. I think always the idea is that if you get in deep into tech diving, that somehow you'll maybe make some money back on helium and everything else. But I think that's just the lies we tell ourselves too.
I think that's just what they put on the brochure to get you in. So can you explain to somebody that has no idea what a rebreather is, what is a rebreather and how does that differ from traditional open circuit? We call rebreathers closed circuit, and there's open circuit. What are the differences?
Yeah, so like with open circuit scuba, the basic concept is you're hauling around a big tank of compressed gas. Your regulator's giving that gas to you at something close to ambient pressure. You inhale it, and when you exhale, it comes out into the water and bubbles all go up to the surface. Very simple. Super kind of bomb-proof design, proven, been around for years and years and years. But you're limited then by the amount of gas that you have, carried in that cylinder. With every exhale, you're losing that gas, and that becomes a little bit problematic when you want to do really deep, really long dives. It becomes more problematic when you want to start mixing in more expensive gases like helium. Yeah. So rebreathers work a little different. Instead of when you exhale, all that gas is bubbling up to the surface, you recycle that gas. It basically is functionally equivalent of breathing in and out of a paper bag. So you're rebreathing the same gas. You inhale and exhale the same gas each time, but the way the rebreather works is it forces that gas to go in a loop with a set of mushroom valves, one-way valves, in what's called the breathing loop. And so when you are breathing in and out of a paper bag, you sort of have two big problems, right? You're going to be metabolizing that oxygen, so you need a way to replace the oxygen you're metabolizing, and as a byproduct of that metabolizing the oxygen in your breath, you're exhaling CO2, and you have to figure out a way to scrub that CO2 out. So the way the rebreather handles that is sending that gas through a soda lime scrubber that basically scrubs out the CO2 and passes it across a set of, there's a few different ways that this can be done, but generally passes it across a set of oxygen sensors. And in the case of the units that both you and I dive, an electronic CCR, it's going to measure that gas, the O2 content, and it's going to decide, is this in the realm of what we have set it to be? And if it drops below that, it's going to trigger a little solenoid to open, and with the rebreather, you're carrying a bottle of O2 and typically a bottle of something else to mix it with, squirts a little bit more O2 in to replace the O2 that you've metabolized. So ultimately through the dive, aside from adding a little bit of diluent in to compensate for the depth that you're at, you're really only consuming that little bit of O2 that you're metabolizing. So you use much, much less gas.
Yeah, I always, when people ask me, I'm sure you experience this too, but when you've got your rebreather sitting out on the back of the truck of the car, it always draws questions, especially around here because not many people dive them. But I always kind of enjoy that kind of look on people's faces when they say, well, why are you diving that? And I say, well, you see this little bottle, my 13 cubic foot, which a 13 cubic foot bottle is a little bit bigger than a 1 liter bottle of cola. I say this little bottle on this unit will last 5 hours versus 80, which an 80 cubic foot, for those of you that may not know, is probably a little bit bigger than the big fire extinguishers you see sitting around, and that might last you an hour depending on how deep you go. So really it's just the amount of time, but it's and then the gas savings, like you mentioned. You inevitably on the rebreather will eventually start looking at trimix and things like that, and then you really start to see the cost value in that, especially when you start buying helium.
It's an amazing thing to, well, first of all, not really be that, like you are in open circuit, just continuously looking at your pressure gauge.
Yeah.
Like that's, between your deco, your no deco time, your gas, you're kind of constantly checking all that. With a rebreather, you're just kind of diving, you as long as you're staying within the very reasonable limits, you're almost never looking, at your gas gauge in terms of that is my limiting factor.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting that the depth you're diving at, to a large extent, does not impact your gas consumption.
Right.
Which is very much different than open circuit. The deeper you dive on open circuit, it dramatically changes your gas consumption. Yeah. That's not the case on a rebreather. So yeah, it is interesting. It sort of breaks those two fundamentals of how you really learn to dive on open circuit. Yeah.
Well, I think we hit on a couple of these points. We'll ask it anyway. So what led you to the rebreather? I mean, I think it'll be pretty obvious, but like, was there one big, just a natural progression, or just is the next thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, well, it's probably two real things. One, probably like you, I'm a bit of a gear nerd. So it's, another thing to play with, another thing to learn. Rebreathers are mechanically fascinating, and they are very different in operation from one to the next. I think that's one thing that, as you look at open circuit, more or less, most of the gear's the same.
Yeah.
Rebreathers operate on the same principles, but from manufacturer to manufacturer, you get very different interpretations of and approaches to rebreather design. So it's just interesting. It's fascinating stuff. But really, it's about the mission. And for me, I like Rex. I like deep stuff. Yeah. And I think over the last, call it 10 years or so, things have really shifted to where if you are going to get into tech diving, getting into deep diving, and especially at the point you start to go into helium, mix helium in the mix. It used to be open circuit, back mount doubles. That was just what you did. And I think it's fair to say at this point that if you're getting into tech diving, if you're not a rebreather diver already, you're thinking about it because it's just so much more efficient. And with helium costs going up, that obviously factors in. But it's not just that. There's so many other benefits to that from a gear loadout standpoint. Your logistics of carrying gas around, it's a much more technical, much more complicated piece of machinery to manage and monitor. But the benefits of that, as long as you're playing by the rules, you're following your checklist, you're doing everything right, is honestly a bit of a safer dive because you got much bigger margin of error. And for deep tech stuff, the fundamentals are if you got gas to breathe, you got time to solve your problem. And rebreathers give you a lot more time to solve problems.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the things that I've experienced. There's this kind of fundamental divide, and it seems to me like it's mostly kind of generational. But you've got the kind of older generation of divers where rebreathers, when they were around, when they were just coming around, and maybe not the safest when they began. And those guys, generally, when you tell them you're a rebreather diver, they're oh my God, you're going to die. Those are so dangerous. I feel way safer on my rebreather than I do on open circuit because I know I've got all the time in the world. I know as long as I'm not getting complacent and I pay attention to what's going on it, you got a lot of options. Like you said, there's
It buys you time.
it buys you time.
Buys you time.
And even if something does fail on it, it doesn't necessarily mean the shit's hitting the fan. You've got options. You've got time. Oh, and by the way, you can just jump back onto open circuit if you have to. It's not a big deal.
It's probably worth calling out, one of the tenets with a rebreather, because it's complicated and because it typically, typical rebreather divers are putting themselves in tech diving situations where you can't just simply ascend if you have an issue. You always have to have a backup. And for rebreather divers, that's called their bailout. And so typically that's a standard bottle or set of bottles of gas on normal open circuit scuba, enough to get you from hypothetically the deepest, farthest point in your dive back safely if your rebreather fail. It's interesting. I was at the Rebreather Forum conference in Malta this spring. And one of the big threads of discussion where the group that was there was really talking about standards and practices in rebreather diving. But one of the things that's I think is really fascinating is the concept of bailout rebreathers is getting much more well accepted. There's standards and practices that the certification agencies are starting to develop curriculum on how to, instead of carrying another bunch of cylinders of open circuit gas, carry out another rebreather, which sounds bonkers, right? In some ways, but if you're doing a lot of deep stuff, I know you're a cave guy, the thought of bringing a bunch of open circuit for a really long distance cave dive, or slinging a side mount rebreather in case you need to bail out. There's some logic there, but it's another level of complexity to manage. Right.
Well, the other side of that too is the rebreathers, as they kind of evolve, they're getting more compact.
Yes.
You look at the old RB80s, they called them the fridge,
because
it was literally like you're wearing this big fridge on your back. Even the SF2 is a base off that, but they're getting smaller and smaller and smaller, more compact.
Got to see, obviously you're diving the Choptima. When I was in Malta, they had talked to the Triton guys of the French chest mount unit. The dive soft guys are there with their side mount Liberty. Obviously KISS is famous for their side mount setup. So there's a lot of different form factors that are coming and that fit into a multi rebreather diving strategy better and better.
Yeah, for sure. So let's, we kind of already nudged on the safety part of it. And I think just generally, we're both tech divers, and I would make the argument that most trained tech divers kind of approach safety at a higher level than most recreational divers do. It's just you have to.
You have to.
But so what are some of the extra steps once you go on a rebreather that you have to be aware, you have to be cognizant of and pay attention to?
Yeah. Well, the first and foremost thing, which is really coming to the almost the mainstream now, is assembly checklists. Assembly and more recently, not just assembly and pre-dive checklists, but they're also talking about now kind of a pre-launch checklist. So when you're putting together this rebreather and checking to make sure it is fully ready to support your dive, I know for mine, I'm guessing it's very similar for yours, variation on a theme. It is a full page checklist. Your every step from assembling each component and testing it, checking your battery voltages, checking your O2 sensors, checking pressure testing it, both negative and positive, making sure that your scrubber's installed properly. You're pre-breathing it to make sure that the CO2 is getting scrubbed out. So there's a whole process to get ready to dive. Because once you're in the water with rebreathing and something goes wrong, it is a exponentially more complicated machine to try to troubleshoot and assess in the water than a standard open circuit.
Yeah.
But then there's also becoming more and more of a push for a pre-launch checklist. Like, great, you've done all that assembly, you've got everything checked out. Now, right before you get in the water, is your O2 on? Is the unit switched on? Do you have the basics ready to go that could have changed since you went through that assembly? But because of those checklists, those are the things that have really worked to improve safety a lot.
Yep.
It's been, I think, I don't know the exact stats. Dan has been doing a bunch of research on CCR accidents, and historically, a lot of that has come down to basic user error. There's some very famous cases of folks going through experienced divers who just forgot to turn their O2 on.
Yep.
And different than an open circuit type of diving experience, when a rebreather goes wrong, it can go wrong in really subtle, kind of insidious ways. So, you don't turn your O2 on, it's not an immediate problem. It becomes a problem over time, and
just go to sleep.
You go to sleep. So, do you have your, HUDs to get those O2 levels right into your line of sight, or are you paying attention to that? So it's same with CO2 scrubbers, or get a little bit of channeling there. All of a sudden, you start to get CO2 buildup. And do you know this? There was an interesting study that the folks at Rebreather Forum went through, and they talked about having putting folks into a pool scenario, and they were testing, can people catch scrubber failure, basically. So some sort of was channeling that you forgot to install the scrubber material, that happens.
Yep.
And so all of these test subjects basically knew they were getting into a lab scenario, safe. There was a bunch of safety mechanisms there, but they knew they were going to be tested for at what point would they decide to bail out.
Yeah.
And almost all of them, even despite knowing that, pushed themselves well past what was safe before. And some of them basically almost didn't bail out, despite knowing the test scenario. And I think that's something, too, that as divers who are, especially technical divers, who are trying to kind of push themselves into admittedly uncomfortable circumstances, it's really, it's a challenge to sort of fight that tendency. When I can do this, I'm okay. Not a problem, I can push through this. When if you just zipped back out and said, does this make sense? No.
Is it really worth it? Going back to the checklist, I have it's like the size of a credit card. It's that's the pre-flight, when you're doing that right before you get in the water or in the water. Like you said, is the O2 on? Are all your systems functioning the way they're supposed to? And then you got the build checklist. I'll throw myself under the bus. The build checklist last year it was almost a year ago to the day. We were in Bon Air doing Helitrox, and I was building it. I had my checklist, but I wasn't physically checking the boxes. I was just going down the list. And thank God I noticed it. Just scanned the table when I got done, but I had got my unit built, getting ready to pick it up and head to the water, and I look down and I see the retaining screw that holds the EAC in.
Oh yeah.
And for those of you that don't know, that is a very important part. It's
a big channel right there.
You basically just have this giant tube where the gas can go through and it doesn't get scrubbed. And basically what would have happened was, in a very short order, I would have taken a hypercapnia hit. Boom. Probably wouldn't have taken very long at all. Would have been a bad day. But luckily, I looked down, I saw it, and I'll tell you what, that was the last time I didn't physically check the boxes when I went down, because that's a big one on there. It says, did you put this cap on? And I would have noticed it, but thank God I did see it. Yeah.
So easy to do. So easy to do, to think, no matter how many times you've done it.
Yeah.
But you just get a little bit distracted. You start thinking about something and you miss a step.
Yeah. There's
not very many steps in that checklist you can miss. And if something goes wrong on that step, you don't have an issue.
Yeah. Yeah. And I had immediately reverted back to when I was getting trained on my unit, because the instructor made a point to say, you cannot forget to put that on. And I did it. But it's interesting. I still feel safer on it, though.
Oh, I absolutely. One of the things that once I'm in the water, it is a different diving experience. And that was one of the things that really struck me starting to dive. You're like, okay, I was a reasonably experienced diver when I started getting the rebreather. And you do kind of have to relearn to dive again a little bit, as maybe talk about buoyancy. But once you get used to it, it is just such a freeing experience. Not just the limitations on your breathing gas is something you're constantly worrying about capacity, but also it's quiet. And that's the other thing that really struck me, is you don't realize how loud open circuit scuba is until you are on a rebreather and you're listening to nothing.
Yeah.
And then you have a group of open circuit folks go by and it sounds like this giant cacophony of bubbles.
Well, and I the first time I dove a rebreather in the ocean was taken back at how much sound there is made by the ocean that you don't hear when you're on closed circuit because you can't, or open circuit because you can't. I mean, just it's almost overwhelming. Just you can hear things crunching and cracking, and there's just so many sounds out there.
100%.
All right. So you'd mentioned the difference in buoyancy. If you don't mind, take me back to like when you're getting trained, the first dive you strap this on. Because that's one of the things people always talk about.
100%. And I think it is universal. I have yet to meet, no matter how experienced, a diver who tries a rebreather for the first time and doesn't be like, holy crap, I feel like a newbie again. So, yeah, the very first dive I did, I remember being in Jesse's pool in his home in Missouri, and they've got a great facility there where we've got a pool there. Strapped the unit on, jumped in the pool. And so, again, for those who aren't familiar, normal open circuit scuba, you have this subconscious function that you learn in terms of managing your buoyancy. Yeah, you have your BC for these big macro adjustments, but most of your buoyancy adjustment, the vast majority, is done with your breathing. You need to go up a little bit. You breathe a bit deeper. If you need to descend a little bit, you exhale a little bit more. And that, kind of gets you up and down through a lot of your dives. You're not really messing with much. With a rebreather, you're breathing in and out of that paper bag. So your buoyancy does not change. Just gases transferring from your lungs to, on a rebreather, called the counter lungs, so little literal bags that you're breathing in and out of. So your buoyancy doesn't change. And that sounds like a really simple, okay, that's fine. But oh my gosh, breathing, I don't know, I still do this. If I switch over from diving open circuit to closed circuit, that first few minutes of that dive is this rewiring your brain. Okay, I'm heading at this thing. I need to go over it. Typically, you'll just subconsciously breathe a little deeper so you can go over maybe that coral head or over that piece of a wreck. You'll breathe in like nothing happened. You breathe in more like crap. I'm on CCR. Your buoyancy doesn't change. Then you hit the thing, or you have to pivot and kick up.
Yeah.
And as soon as you pivot and kick up, then the volume in the counter lung changes, and then you have this whole series of things now you have to manage, an extra gas space to manage. But it was definitely a getting used to setting a depth that you are set to dive at and trying to use then your kicking to stay roughly at that depth and being ready to do the dance of adjustments when you descend or ascend.
Yeah. When
you really don't do that when you're on open circuit. It just sort of happens mostly by itself, just to your subconscious as you've experienced that on open circuit. So it is a relearning to dive. I maybe talk about it a little bit, like the difference between diving and automatic transmission and stick. Yeah. Because as you're going up and down, as you're descending, you've got another airspace to manage in those counter lungs. So you need to be ready to, add some gas as you're descending, or vent through your nose or whatever your setup is as you're ascending. And that is very different than, what you have to do. Your lungs don't feel the ascent on open circuit. They do when you are on closed circuit. And there's nothing quite like that first time on the descent. You bottom out those counter lungs. You're like, and that's as I've dove with various people. That sensation doesn't bother me. I'm like, okay, I know you have the ADV, the automatic add valve will catch it, or I'll add some. But that experience of bottoming out the counter lung, I've talked to several rebreather divers who are like, that freaked me the F out.
Yeah. You learn a lot about yourself on that first dive and how you can handle stress. Because I know I bottomed the bag out, and I was like, okay, I can't breathe. Gonna have to do something here. And you for that fraction of a second, you get that feeling of I gotta get out of here. But then you're like, nah, I got it. But yeah, if you've got an ADV, you can turn it on. Like you said, you can manually add it, but it's kind of weird. Like you almost get used to that feeling.
Yep.
It stops bothering you after a while.
You kind of expect it. I'm descending because there's a concept in rebreather diving called minimum loop volume. You really want to try to have be right at that point of bottoming that out with normal breathing, because the more you have, the more is changing when you're going up and down. So there's that. Almost it converts to this panicky to like a, okay, great, I'm right there. I know where I'm at.
Yeah, and it's like, it's an extra level of task loading too, right? And so like, I know I'll be on a descent and it'll bottom, and I'm like, I got to put some gas in, but I got to do this first, and you fix something else, and then you're like, okay, now you go. Yeah.
Well, and on mine, I've got, I think it's different than yours. I've got a bailout valve on mine. So for those of you who are listening, it's basically a combination of the rebreather mouthpiece, but you can turn a knob and it converts to an open circuit. So for bailing out, I can turn this knob on the front, and I've got standard scuba gear that I can breathe out of. But the way it works also is it also acts as the automatic diluent valve. So if I suck in, when I bottom it out, if I suck in just a little bit more, it'll open that and let some diluent in. So, but I can turn that ADV on or off depending on the mode. So I've also been in a situation where I didn't have it in ADV mode, and all it bottoms out and I just suck harder because I expect that to let gas in. Like, oh, it's not in that mode.
Yeah. I don't have that luxury on mine. It's either on or it's off, and if I've got a bail, I've got to go through the whole shut it down, get the other reg out. But so I'm just laughing now thinking of all the fun times during that 5 days of getting trained on the unit, and the buoyancy thing. I like that analogy you use with the difference between an automatic and a stick, because they talk about staying ahead of the unit. It's like, if you can imagine, it's like walking down a hallway and trying to anticipate 5 steps ahead of where you're at.
Well, and I think you add a layer, like if you're diving dry suit, you have this like cycle of, okay, I'm descending. Yep. I've got okay, am I getting suit squeeze? I'll put a little in there. Then how's my buoyancy doing? Yep. Might put a little in there. And then you've got your breathing loop. How close am I to bottoming? Yep. When you go up a little bit, all of those gas spaces simultaneously expand. So, okay, how am I going to manage each of those? Because if my loop volume is too high and I want to expand that, it's going to drop my buoyancy. So I probably shouldn't be letting stuff out of my BC or my dry suit. So you have this a little bit of a dance. You get used to it, and it becomes second nature, but it is a retraining of the brain.
And it's not uncommon to I try not to do it, but it is not uncommon as well to see rebreather divers. And if they come to a coral head, instead of going over it, they go around it.
Absolutely.
To hell with that. Stay at the same depth. Yeah.
I don't know how many times I was out in Grand Cayman with mine 2 months ago, and there was a couple of times we were diving around this wreck, and I'm like, well, I have a choice of going, at this depth in and around, or hey, I might go up and look here. I'm like, no, I'm going to go around.
Go around. Yep.
Just and that also becomes a subconscious thing. I'm not even sure I thought about it at the time, but you start to know if both paths look equally interesting. Yeah, this is the path of least resistance.
Yeah. So. Well, and it's kind of funny too, because we have such an enormous gas supply, but you start to become kind of a gas miser too. The thought of venting that gas out when you don't have to, you're like, nah, I'm just gonna keep this in here. There's no reason to let it go. Yeah. So there's basically two, when you get into rebreathers, there's basically like two subsets. You've got mechanical and electronic. Tell me what the difference between those are.
Well, so you've got basically it all really comes down to how do you want to manage the O2 percentage in your system. So different than a open circuit system. So I'll compare and contrast that. You have a bottle of something. If it's air, you've got a fixed percentage of O2 in that, and as you go up or down, the PO2, partial pressure of oxygen, goes up and down. In a rebreather, they call it a fixed PO2 system. So you set the partial pressure of oxygen you want, and the machine is tasked with keeping that O2 at the level that you want it. In essence, trying to keep enough oxygen in it to keep you conscious and alive no matter what depth. So most of the time, rebreather divers have no idea what the actual mix is that they are breathing. A lot of your computers tell you if you flip through some menus, but you may have no idea what the percentage of oxygen is in the mix, but you do know what the partial pressure of oxygen is. So with a electronic rebreather, an ECCR, the way that works is it's basically passing that gas that you're inhaling, exhaling over typically multiple O2 sensors because they are failure prone. And it's measuring how much O2 is in the mix. And if it gets a little bit too low, it triggers automatically, typically, a solenoid to fire to squirt in a little bit of O2 to top it up to whatever level you set it at. And those O2 sensors also will alarm if it gets too high, which can happen. A manual rebreather or semi-closed rebreather, there's a few different ways this can work. A fully manual one, you are doing that yourself with some manual push buttons to basically add in, and as part of an ECCR routine, you'll learn to fly your rebreather, as they say, manually. But you also have rebreathers that are designed with a little orifice in it that is very, very, very finely tuned to continuously trickle in, just call it a constant mass orifice. I forgot the technical name, but it's basically, the science behind them is fascinating. It's basically using the speed of the gas through this very finely tuned orifice to squirt in a very specific number of molecules of oxygen in a certain rate that is dependent on the ambient pressure. So ultimately, this thing, in theory, will keep you going with enough oxygen at least to stay conscious and coherent without all the fancy solenoids and electronic monitors. You typically augment those with electronics to monitor things and potentially be able to look for over-oxygen situations or under-oxygen situations. But in theory, those units, KISS is the most famous of those, should keep you going without really having to have any electronics running.
Right.
So different schools of thought, different groups like different things. Certainly the ECCRs are arguably more popular these days, but they are also more complicated. That the semi-closed or the manual CCRs are much more simple, and there is certainly in the technical diving world a strong community who believes simple's better. And KISS is a great example. I know lots of buddies who dive those and swear by them. So.
Yeah. And so, just like to touch on the rebreathers, if you're a nitrox diver, you actually, whether you know it or not, you have a fairly good foundation on what the rebreather's doing, right? So essentially, the rebreather is, we're wearing a nitrox mixing station on our bodies when we dive, and it is trying to replicate the best mix for whatever depth we're at. That's what lets us stay down longer with longer NDLs. That's what have shorter decompression, because it's, like you said, it's altering that PPO2. Whereas you learn in your nitrox, we're really on open circuit, you're concerned about the PPO2 getting too high. You've got two ends of that spectrum on a rebreather. Don't want to go in too high, don't want to go in too low, because one will cause you to tox, one will cause you to go to sleep.
Yeah.
So it's just one more thing you have to look at on it.
I mean, really, when you think about rebreathers, you've got the benefit of much more efficient gas use. Obviously, you're just burning up that O2 that you're metabolizing. It's quiet. You've got warm, moist air that you're breathing instead of bone-dry, cold air out of your scuba tank. And for long dives, that's really good. And there's also a science that warm, moist air helps a little bit fight off decompression sickness in long dives, which is a benefit. And then for decompression, it's a big deal. So you are, typically there's lots of schools of thought. So I keep mine typically at a 1.2-ish, for the majority of my travel dive. I might pop it up a little bit during deco, but for open circuit, when you're going through decompression, you're only hitting that perfectly optimal decompression.
That's my dog. Every time my wife leaves, he goes into severe separation withdrawal. Let me fix that real quick.
Yeah.
All right, dog crisis averted.
Right. So, what I was saying is, like on an open circuit, when you're going through decompression, you're typically planning based off how many gases you want to bring, really. a number of decompression stops where as soon as a gas gets breathable, basically it's got the most PO2 you can handle without risking oxygen toxicity. That's your gas switch point. And that's great for that moment in time when you're at that depth. You're doing great. You're in essence decompressing as efficiently as you can. But as you start to ascend on that open circuit gas, the PO2 drops and it gets less and less efficient. You want to have as much O2 in the mix as you can when you're going through your decompression strategy. So you're losing efficiency. You'll switch to the new gas. You'll momentarily have a great PO2, and then it'll start to taper off as you ascend. And to your point on CCR, it is theoretically perfect the entire time up. Basically, It's keeping that as topped up on O2 as you can make it through that entire ascent plan, which makes your decompression as short as you reasonably can have it, which is super important, especially if you've done a long dive and you are cold and hungry and tired and getting jellyfish in the face and everything else that can happen.
I'm not going to say it completely justifies the cost of a rebreather, but just not having dry mouth is huge.
It's a big deal.
I mean, 20 minutes on open circuit, and I'm like, but with the rebreather, you don't even notice it. It's so nice.
Yeah. It is probably worth mentioning that is one of the other interesting. So rebreather failures are interesting. Your O2 sensors can fail. Your CO2 scrubber can fail. You can forget to turn your O2 on or whatever. One of the interesting differences is you can't take the regulator. You can just take that regulator out, whatever. Put that back in your mouth with a rebreather. That's an open breathing loop, and if you don't close it before you take it out, it'll fill with water, and then you have
bad things
happening. Because, by the way, that soda lime that's doing the CO2 scrubbing gets highly caustic when it gets wet.
Yeah.
So they call that a caustic cocktail, which can burn your lips and mouth and whatever else it comes into contact with. So needless to say, you don't want water in that breathing loop. And I have known more than a few people who have had the, oops, I forgot to close the breathing loop. Sometimes it's even on the surface before the dive. They jump in and
just let it
whoops.
hang.
Yeah. Just more stuff to think about.
Yeah. So let's touch off of maintenance and care, difference between open circuit and rebreather diving. I'm going to throw out real quick. You better like to be a tinkerer, and you better like to mess with things if you're going to have a rebreather. You want to touch off on that?
Oh, no, 100%. I think if you're not the kind of person that is somewhat anal retentive with your gear, that you're not in the habit of rinsing it, cleaning it, inspecting it between each dive as an open circuit diver, you should probably think pretty hard about, is CCR really the right thing? Because it is. Open circuit is pretty resilient. You can kind of drag it through the mud. You can neglect maintenance, and it's not good, and it will fail at some point for sure. But with a rebreather, every time you are done with it, you're not just rinsing it, but you're disinfecting it. Stearamine is the CCR diver's friend. You are going through and inspecting all of the seals. You are looking for leaks and problems. You're storing it away carefully, and when you're traveling with it, it's a whole nother level of care about traveling with it, because some of these parts get cracked or broken, and that's not just I can go down to the shop and get a replacement, because that might be a part very specific to your unit. So you're carrying around lots of extra parts. It is a much more complicated thing to service, and it demands that you pay attention to problems. We were diving during one of our thing, and I think I had a bit of a turned out inside the diaphragm. It's my open circuit set. The diaphragm had a little bit of a fold in it, and it was letting some water in. My rig was breathing a little bit wet, and I dove for most of the day with it like that. It was a little bit annoying, but I took it apart, fixed it. I would not do that on it. Any little problem like that turns into big problems later.
Well, I have a prime example about not, I was down in we were in Bon Air, and it was towards the end of the week. I think it was maybe Thursday. We were going to the hooker, and we were going to dive on it, and had been down on it for about an hour swimming around. And I started, I was between the keel of the boat and the reef. It sits on its side there, and took a breath and heard the gurgling sound. Like, oh, that's not good. So I took a couple more breaths. Okay, it's still gurgling. I de-water it, goes away. 2 breaths, comes right back, starts gurgling again. Okay, I'll de-water it one more time. Gurgle comes back immediately and with a force. So I'm like, okay, I'm getting off of it because I don't want to take a hit. I signal to Scott, say, hey, come here. I pull out my wet notes, just gurgling real big on it. I'm getting off of it. Well, anyway, what had happened is it built the unit, and I wasn't really very cautious with where I put it in the back of the truck. And what had happened was we're going down the, bumpy roads there in Bon Air on the way to the dive site, and something had hit my unit and it cracked the MAV. So water was just flooding into the unit. As soon as we got back to the dive shop, and I put it in the rinse tank, and there's just all these bubbles coming out. I was like, crap. Luckily, the dive shop, they're a dive right shop, so they had another one, swapped it on. It was an expensive mistake. Yeah. Could have gone worse, but I guarantee from that point on, every other dive we went, it was setting very well in a protected area. But yeah, you have to, even the things you don't think about.
I came back from my trip to Grand Cayman, and I unpacked my unit from a hard suitcase that was packed in around with wetsuits and all kinds of stuff, padding, but still somehow the exhaust valve on my counterlung had snapped off. And so it's one of those things where you have to inspect it out of every dive. I hadn't paid attention and just threw it in there. Next time we're going down to Bon Air, I go down and there's a missing exhaust valve. That would have been a problem. The noise thing is interesting. Because you can hear so well, there's also this sort of, I don't know, the standard sounds of your rebreather you get to know, like the firing of the solenoids. Yours might be different. Mine are right behind my head.
It's really hard for me to hear mine because they're down by my
they're
navel.
real low. But I can hear, you can hear them. Like I'll see the PO2 drop a little, and you'll hear the click, 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 click. And it's just like this reassuring sound of, okay, the solenoids are working. And then the gurgling sound, which is, I got water in my counterlung, and is it a little bit, is it a lot? And if I force it out, how quickly does it come back? That you start to hear or feel some of these things that can really tell you if you're going to have a good outcome or a bad outcome. Yeah,
in my real world job, I deal a lot with industrial machinery, and they talk about operators. They kind of get used to the song of the machine, and then you can tell just by the sound things that a normal person wouldn't necessarily pick up, but they'll hear it immediately. And it's very much the same. Like, if there's nobody around me, no open circuit divers, I can hear the solenoid clicking. Excuse me. It's very, very faint for me because it's so low, but I can hear my mushroom valves popping open and close when I breathe. You get a little thump, 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 things like that. Yeah, it's really interesting, and you start, well, that's not normal, and you start focusing on a lot of things. It was stupid. It wasn't a big deal. It was stupid, but I was playing around at the end of the last time I was on my unit. It was only like 30 feet of water swimming around, and I was just screwing around, changing my set points, and I thought I had set it back to the low, and I was swimming along, and I looked down, and I was like, why is it still up so high? And so I did a dill flush, and it came down, came right back up, and it's just like, no. But those are the things you that's part of not being complacent. It was a good thing. You should always know your PPO2, right? So
and it's an interesting thing too, because you have to think through, and I probably, like you, I am very interested in analyzing other accidents I hear about to figure out, okay, how would I have acted in that particular situation? What happens if that solenoid gets stuck closed? What happens if it gets stuck open? What happens if, and you start to go through those things, and that is just more to think about than a typical open circuit. So it makes it sound really scary and complicated, and it, in some ways, if you're not approaching it with respect, it probably can be. But if you're doing everything right, you followed the checklists, you've gotten trained well, practiced your bailouts, practiced your drills, doing the dives, to your point, just becomes much more effortless. There's less to worry about. It's almost more it's just more peaceful in many ways for me to dive CCR.
I would 1,000% agree with you on that. So let's talk about the training side of it a little bit, because I get, I'm sure you have been too. I've been asked by dive buddies who don't necessarily dive rebreathers, and they're like, so if I go buy one, can I go dive it? Like, they won't even give it to you. You until you've done the training. Like, only your instructor can have it shipped to them. But like, if you call KISS tomorrow and say, hey, I want to order a Sidewinder, great, can you send us a copy of your cert?
Yep.
Otherwise, they're not going to give it to you. So you tell me a little bit, or tell us a little bit about the whole training process.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It is not just like you're getting CCR certified. You're getting CCR certified for a specific unit.
Yeah.
Well, even you and I dive variations of an Optima. I've got a back mount. You've got a chest mount. Those are two different certifications, despite the units being in many ways similar.
Right.
They are different enough where I could get a crossover, but it's not the same cert. So you have to pick out your unit, which is a little bit odd, right? You're picking out a unit before you've likely spent much, if any, time on it.
Yeah.
A lot of times you can go and try them out in various events, but you're picking a unit, you're picking a teacher, and there's typically a lot fewer CCR instructors for the unit you want in the region you're going to be in. And then you get the unit, you come out, and you're learning to build it, you're learning to test it, you're learning to troubleshoot, how it works. You're getting in the water, and it's sort of like a crawl, walk, run thing, right? You're getting in confined water and just learning how to manage your buoyancy all over again. And then from that point forward, it's getting hours on it. It's practicing drills, practicing failures, taking it apart, putting it together. But different than open circuit, there's most certifications have an hours requirement. So it is not just that you have demonstrated the necessary skills once or twice. You actually have to have a certain number of hours doing the particular activity that you're getting certified for, whether that's kind of standard or maybe it's an air dill or a Heliotrux or a Trimix. You're getting enough hours to have had experience enough to be able to do the diving in whatever that situation you're getting certified for. And that is a good thing.
Yeah.
Like, one of the things with rebreathers it isn't just that you go through the skills and you're good at it. You need to have some time on it. So that's one of the things I have respected about the agencies who put together these curriculum is that hours requirement's a big deal, but it does mean that you have a commitment to that, not just, all right. So for my first CCR certification, I've gone through all the skills, but it's about getting hours. So I remember, coming up with tasks. I mean, me and Jesse went around and I did some mapping at our local scuba park. I'm, thinking of things where you need to spend enough hours on it, especially since you will be spending a lot of hours on long dives in it, that you're comfortable, not just for the first 10 minutes, but the first 2 hours and 10 minutes, feeling what it's like to be, breathing on it for that length of time.
Yeah, it's definitely a, like you compare it, I compare it to open water in the sense that you're kind of relearning how to dive.
Sure, certainly. Yeah, certainly.
So, but like your open water, if you're an open water certified diver, it was 4 dives. You went down to a lake or the ocean, you did your 4 dives, and great, you're now an open water diver. The rebreather is a much longer commitment with reason, but 5 days and I think 8 hours total, something like that. I think I had almost 10 by the end of mine, just because we just had some time, and so we did longer dives. But I remember the same thing. We had gone to I'm blanking out on the name of the place. It's down in Florida. Blue Grotto has the bell, but it's kind of the sloping incline, and had to build hours, and going again back to rebreather divers liking to stay at the same level. He was like, nah, you're going to do a circuit. You're going to go up to 20 feet and come down to 70 and turn it. And I swam that circle for hours, just going around, reversing directions, things like that. Then, okay, your nerd failed. Now you go to your HUD and things like that. And just, it's with good reason that you go to it. And
one of the things I do, folks that have been interested and, hey, I might be interested in getting into rebreathers, one of the things I will recommend very strongly, if they have not already done it, is a combination of a side mount course and an intro tech course, whether it's Tech 40 or Intro to Tech or Advanced Deco Procedure, whatever the agency that you're with does. But the math and the physiology of those intro tech courses is very similar, or at least applicable to the CCR side of the world. And getting used to slinging and managing side mount bottles, because you are universally going to have something slung to you, typically on your side. Sometimes you could manage that on your back, depending on the unit, but you've got bailout gas to manage. And so that is a little bit of also the myth, hey, I don't have to carry around very much gas. Well, that is true if everything goes perfect, but you can't plan for that to go perfect. So you will be hauling some other bottles around, and learning to manage those is an additional skill that I think both you and I went into the rebreather training having had. But I think if I was fresh out of single tank back mount and I wanted to jump on CCR, that experience managing extra bottles is something that would be an additional stressor on the whole system.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've actually read some articles from rebreather instructors, and there's some that advocate, hey, if you think you're going to be, if you're going to become a rebreather diver and you know that, they're like, go ahead and start immediately, like even if you're just fresh out of open water. But like you said, I can't imagine somebody that has basically just learned how to dive now having to manage 2 or more bottles and all this other stuff. It'd be crazy. Yeah.
Back in the day, and this is, I don't know how long ago, this is like the Hollis Explorer, there are some others, there is the idea of the recreational rebreather. And this was, this idea that you might even get your open water certificate on a semi-closed rebreather. And there was a couple of companies that were pushing that real hard, and that kind of dissolved. Who knows, maybe at some point we'll get back to that, as the systems just aren't that foolproof yet. But it is a complicated, and I think the moral of that story is it's still complicated. And so having the patience, and I think that analytical sort of calm, cool collectedness in the water under stress, I think that's probably for me maybe the test of, hey, if you get stressed out in the water, can you stay calm? Can you keep a level head? Figure out how to work problems. If you've got that sort of mindset, sure, jump in. I think that's, if you get real panicky and freaked out in the water, all of us probably do in certain circumstances, but this is a lot to manage. And having that, okay, stop, take a breath, work the problem mindset is important for.
Right. And I'll add to that too. If you got the mentality of, or if you don't have the maturity level of a diver, or you have the mentality of, well, this thing's a computer controlled unit and I'll just let it keep me alive while I go do something, that's not going to work for you very well at all. Yeah. So tell me about your best dive on a rebreather.
Ooh, that's an interesting question. Best dive. I'm not sure this is my best dive on a rebreather, but it was a lot of fun. I took, I've done this twice now. I've taken my rebreather down to Bonterre Mine, which on one hand is this really kind of masochistic experience because you're hauling this. Mine, and I don't have the luxury like you do with your chest mount unit. I've got to carry my O2 and my dill bottles down and the frame and everything. So it's not light. But hauling that down into the mine and more importantly back up is not the most fun. But it's I like that type of diving anyway because it's peaceful and quiet and it's dark and there's no current and you just feel like you're weightless floating in space. But you add a rebreather to that, you don't have the bubbles and you don't have the chaos that comes with all of that noise, and the subconscious worry about your gas supply and everything sort of diminishes. And I think just floating around doing some of those dives with it's kind of the closest I could think of just feeling like floating in space, almost carefree in a way. I really like that. Did some great dives down in Grand Cayman, did a couple of wrecks down there. very clear, calm ocean dives. I did a couple at night inside some wrecks, which was really awesome. It was the first time I'd done any nighttime wreck diving on it. Those were amazing. Yeah, it's probably the big ones. How about you?
I think it's to come. I'm pretty sure in December when we go down to Bon Air. I'm pretty sure Zach will take us on the Windjammer. I'm hoping so anyway. And that's one I've wanted to do for a while.
I'm super looking forward to that trip.
I've seen pictures and have some friends that have dove it with Zach Richardson at Technical Diving Services. It's a really cool wreck I want to see. It's this big wooden sailing, like Dutch slave era ship that was hauling tar that sank. It sets at about 200 feet and the tar field is still there. So that's awesome. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I don't know. Up to that, I've gone in. I've been in, and it's just it's a simple dive. I've done open circuit before, but just the fact doing that same dive on closed circuit, Orange Grove and Peacock, inside a cave when you've got these hard rock walls. The sound of open circuit gas when you exhale and it goes up the ceiling and like it's rushing up the ceiling out of the cave, almost sounds like a freight train. It's like, but then you go to this it's kind of a whole different experience. But I'll probably add is the Oriskany. We did last summer. That might probly count. Goddamn COVID.
Yeah, exactly.
Kept me up.
We did me and a couple buddies did just a fantastic 100-foot viz, almost no current. Surface was crummy on the second day, good on the first day, but the dive itself dropped down onto the Oriskany's big aircraft carrier, went down into the hangar deck, so crawled around inside the hangar deck, and it was just that was probably, if I had to pick my favorite, that was pretty epic.
I got to get back. I got to get down there. I got COVID and couldn't go on that one. But I want to get on it with a scooter and get somebody to get video of me like coming in like I'm landing on the deck. I think that'd be cool.
Well, that's such a big wreck that if you wanted to do it justice, really, we were doing pretty long dives on it, but still not seeing the whole thing because it's 900 feet long, right? Yeah. Is the top of the island, the control tower is like at 80 feet, and the sand's at 220, 230, something like that. So there's a whole lot of ship to look at. So scooters and a rebreather, that pairing of scooters and a rebreather is kind of an epic combo because you got distance and you got time that you can play.
All right, well, we'll have to start playing that.
Yep.
Well, cool. Well, thanks. Thanks for coming and sitting on this.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. This is fun.
Yeah, we're both gearheads, so I knew we'd have plenty to talk.
I'm just a clown. That's what they say.